In this video, we're going to finish up the game. The main thing we need to do is print the game board one last time after the conditions for the end of the game have been reached. Now, to check to see if the game should end, we have two variables, side 1 for player 1's side and side 2 for player 2's side. After declaring those variables, we have a for loop that adds on to side 1 any stones that are on player 1's side, and likewise adds to side 2 any stones on player 2's side. And then we check to see if either one of those, either side 1 or side 2, is equal to 0, and if so, we end the game. Any stones left on a player's side goes into that player's Mancala, and then we set the bin amounts within the board to 0. Alright, well, if that happens, I want to print the game board one last time. So I'm going to go up and copy the code that prints the game board. So up here at the start of our main while loop for the game, I'm going to skip over the message code and start down here and copy most of this, although I'm not going to include the player 1 bin indicators at the bottom. I'm just going to copy that code there and paste it at the end. And this should print the board one last time. But I need to do a couple things to adjust it. I don't want to print the A, B, C, D, E, and F above the board. And more importantly, I want to make sure that the tabbing is right. So I want everything to be over to the left one. So I'm basically taking away one tab because we're now outside of that main while loop of the game. So it's important to keep in mind how tabbing sets up blocks of code in Python. If you want your code to run correctly, you need to make sure that the tabbing of the lines of code is the way you want it. Alright, well, to this code I want to add a couple more things. Let me add a print line up above just to add some spacing between what came before. So I'm going to add a blank line there. And then after the declaration that the game is over, let me add an if statement to see who won. So if the bin amount in index 13 is less than the bin amount treated as an integer in index 6, that means that player 1 has won the game, and so we can print a message to that effect. And if the opposite is true, I can check that with an else if. If the bin amount at index 13 is greater than the bin amount at index 6, it means that player 2 has won the game. But of course, the game could also end in a tie, so I'll put an else statement at the very end and say the game ended in a tie. And now let me add one more print line here to just put a little bit of a space between those declarations and the final printing of the game board. So this new code should do a good job signaling the end of the game and giving information about who won and all that. Let's run this new version of the code. But now, before we properly test this code and try to work through an entire game, let me point out a couple problems I noticed before starting this tutorial. We need to make some adjustments to the code. If I type in something invalid, so not Q to quit the game or not A, B, C, D, E, or F, if I type in M or some other random letter and then hit enter, there's a problem. The giveaway pile hadn't been defined. So a similar issue relates to a couple other variables, and to fix this issue, I want to make sure that variables that are used broadly in the code are defined. And so we can do that by defining them at the very beginning. So before we really get into the thick of our program, I've done this for a few variables, and I should have done it for a few more. So what I'd like to do is define the value of the giveaway pile. I'm going to say the value is -1 at first, just to give it a value so we don't run into the problem that we just saw. And I want to do something similar with the variable last recipient. I'll also give that an initial value of -1. And likewise, let's define chosen bin here, again with -1. And a second thing here, if we do have a message code of -1 or -2, I don't want to switch between player 1 and player 2. So I want to change this else block to an else if and add the condition that the message code needs to be greater than or equal to 0. So I think with those changes, we'll have a fully functional game. So let's run this code and check it out. Now, first off, to try to test all the ins and outs and messages that might occur, let me enter something meaningless. And we see invalid input, so that's good. That's what we want to see. If I press D, I should get a second turn for player 1, and I do. And let me press D again to see the message for an empty bin. Great. If I choose A now, it should switch to player 2's turn. And let's say player 2 chooses E. That should give them a second turn, and it does. And let's say they try to choose E again, and we see you must choose a non-empty bin, player 2. Okay. If they enter something meaningless, we see the invalid input message for player 2. Well, let's try to work through the game properly now. So if player 2 chooses F, and then player 1 chooses F as well. Now let's have player 2 choose D. Let's have player 1 choose E. Now if we have player 2 choose E, that one stone will land in an empty bin, and they should claim all 7 stones from the other side. And that's what happened. But player 1 can do something similar by choosing F, and they cleared some stones from player 2's side. And yet again, if player 2 chooses F, they'll get to clear some stones from player 1's side. Now let's have player 1 choose A. They get to go again, and their only option is to choose D. Now it's player 2's turn. Let's say they choose C. And player 1 chooses D. Let's have player 2 choose A. Player 1 chooses F. And in their final move, player 2 only has one choice, so they're going to choose B. This should end the game, and it does. That one stone landed in an empty bin, and so player 2 claimed it. All the stones on player 1's side went into player 1's Mancala, and there were enough there for them to win the game. So we see the message, the game is over, player 1 has won the game. So the code seems to be working pretty well. I'm sure there are some adjustments and improvements that could be made. In particular, we could add a feature to play against the computer, either with the computer making random choices or thoughtful choices. But I'll save that potentially for a future series of tutorials. I hope you enjoyed working through this set of tutorials and learning about for loops and while loops and if and else statements. Thanks for watching, and happy coding.